but they're going to tell you that's not really what they believe. They believe a little bit different. Now, the writer to Hebrews is making reference to Psalm 95, where presumably David, there is no superscription above the psalm for us to know who really wrote it, but it is a reflection in the Psalms about the events that happened with Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness, where they had come to a place where they needed water, even though they had seen the miracles of God in Egypt, even though he had provided for them. And the references to when Moses had to strike the rock and water came out. Then there is a reference to 39 years later, and it might well have been the same place. And they began to murmur, "We need water." And Moses said, "They are getting ready to stone me." And he was supposed to speak to the rock, but he struck it again. And also in the psalm, there's a reference to Kadesh Barnea, where the Lord brought them to the very entrance to the promised land. You remember the story. The spies went out. They came back and said, "It's a great place, but we will never be able to take it because these people are like giants. They live in walled cities. The Lord has deceived us." Only Joshua and Caleb were faithful. There are people who might be among us who are remarkably similar. They've heard the words of the Lord. They know what the promises are, but they're not too sure they can trust the Lord. Now, Martin Luther was very clear and wrote extensively on trusting God and what it means not to trust God. And just as a way of introduction here, if you can think of someone you don't trust, or a time in your life when you were dealing with someone you didn't trust. We may think of the current situation with newspapers and the journalism. And we've gotten to the place we can't trust almost anybody. Whatever the news accounts say today, our first response is this propaganda or is this true? Because you've been telling us stories for so many years now. You've been giving us spin and blatantly biased perspectives. We may have dealt with somebody who, for whatever reasons, was not honest with us. They might have promised us something they didn't do. They might have asked us to be faithful to them in a certain way, and then they didn't take care of their part. We may think of somebody like some sort of a salesman who would tell you anything just to get the sales. And Martin Luther says, now think about God in that way. What you're saying is what the children of Israel were saying as they were camped at Kadesh Barnea. I know what you've told me. I clearly understand. This isn't a case where you're not too sure what the Bible really means. You've come to that place where the Lord said, this is what I have for you. And the children of Israel are saying, this is not what we want. You're not giving us what we want. You have deceived us. And it's hard to understand, what were they expecting? Were they expecting empty cities? Were they expecting sort of like a new housing development where all the houses are done and they're just going to move in? We think of those times perhaps in our life when we were faced with challenges. And it began to be that we were not too sure we wanted to accept what the Lord had brought in our life. We were expecting something very different. For those of you that have gone through the experience of sitting in a doctor's office and hearing the word cancer, you might have had those ideas. Wait a minute, I've gone to church regularly. I've put money in the plate. I'm not supposed to get this type of a disease. I'm supposed to be blessed. Isn't that what some of the preachers tell me? The more faithful I am, the more money I have, the better car I'll have. What's going on here? This isn't the case where we come into challenging times and we go through the process of accepting what the Lord has brought in our lives and we become obedient and faithful. That's a different process. Some of us have gone through some very difficult events in our life. I mean, we might have initially started out with, why is God doing this to me? But we do end up with, well, if this is what the Lord has brought into my life, I'm going to try to deal with it. That's a different situation. These verses are dealing with those who have come to a place in their life where they can say, I know this is what God is speaking. I know this is what God is giving. I know this is the path before me, but I don't want to take it. I want something different. And we saw last week how God responded. He was angry with these people. Therefore, I was angry with this generation. If you flip back or remember from Psalm 95, your translation might be a little weak. Psalm 95:10, I'm supposing most of your translations will have the word grieved. I was grieved with this generation. As if God had his feelings hurt. I'm trying to lead these people, and I'm trying to show them how they need to go, and they're not being nice to me. They're not cooperating. Well, he might have disappointment, but this word is much stronger than that. Really, if you look in the original languages, and in almost every other verse where this word is used for grieve, it's translated detest. Detest. That puts things in a little bit different light. So when we rebel against God and we know the truth but we don't follow it and we come up with our own excuses why, he detests us, he loathes us. And he said in his anger, they will not enter my rest. Well, we begin now in verses 12. As we look at this letter written to at least one Hebrew church, we of course are keeping in mind that there are three different groups. There are those that are trying to walk and be good followers of Jesus. There are those that are trying to make up their mind. And there are those who maybe are just coming for the fellowship and the food. We've got to keep those three different perspectives. He has just written to those who can't seem to make up their mind. If you're coming to church and you're hearing the truth, the expectation is you're going to be faithful and be obedient. Well, now he picks up in verse 12, and he's going to address those who are coming to church and hearing the truth and trying to be faithful. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end. Now, I think I can get through those verses this morning. It's interesting that this section starts out with a clear command. Your translation, New American Standard, I'm reading from, has take care. It's actually much stronger than that. This is a command. It comes from the word to look. And so what the writer is saying is, be vigilant. Be on the lookout. Constantly be looking for, constantly be examining. Constant. Not just every once in a while. This is a command that just has no end. If you're coming to church, if you're hearing the truth, you need to be constantly aware, be constantly on the lookout. For what? And brethren, that's all of you, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart. A constant command. Be constantly vigilant. Today. Not on a special occasion. You know, every once in a while when we do communion, you might spend a little bit of extra time in prayer. This is something you constantly do, and you start today and you just do this constantly. You're becoming very aware. You're looking for. You're vigilant. Lest there be in any one of you an unbelieving heart. Now notice what this doesn't say. This doesn't say be constantly on the lookout in everyone else. See if you can find a problem in someone else. Now, as a good Baptist, we might be pretty good at that. That's not what this says. You're to be concerned with your heart. Has your heart gotten to the place where you have unbelief? And remember what unbelief is. Unbelief is where you say, I know what the truth is, I know what the verse is, but I kind of take it a different way. I probably know what I should be doing, but I'm not going to do it. Because I have special excuses, see? Several years ago, I won't tell you how many, I was in college at Simpson, and I had to read through a particular group of books for a minor prophets class. And it was a particularly liberal book, Patterson's Goodly Fellowship of the Prophets. And I had all my protective screens up, and I was not going to believe anything this guy wrote. He thought they were all made up after the fact just to look like prophecy. And then he came up with a statement. All sin is a disbelief in who God is. And I had to stop, and I went back and did I read that right? All sin is a disbelief in who God is. Now, unfortunately, he didn't develop that point, but the writer to Hebrews here is. For you to sin, what you are saying is, I know what I should be doing, but I don't believe God. I either don't believe God has the best for me, I don't believe that's really what God means, I don't believe God is going to respond to my sin, I just don't believe any of this, I'm going to do what I want. All sin is a disbelief in who God is. And of course, the example is from Numbers chapter 14. The children of Israel were very clear what God's plan for them was. You're going to go into this land. I'm going to give it to you. You're going to have to go through some battles. I will be with you. You're going to be victorious. Go in and spy out the land. And the spies came back and they all said, oh, it's a great land, but this is not what we expected. The Lord is not to be trusted. Wait a minute. You're telling me God is lying to you, or he's not in control of everything, or you somehow know a better plan? That's apparently what they were deciding, remember? And they wanted to stone Moses and go back to Egypt. The same thing that happened at Massah 39 years later. They didn't have water. They were going to stone Moses and say, let's elect a leader and go back to Egypt. It may be that as we go through life, we come to those parts where we don't really want to follow God's clear truth, and we think that our old ways, our old habits, our old lifestyle actually is better. Not maybe the really bad sins. Not the real gross sins, but apparently there's some parts that are better than this will that God apparently wants me to have, which, requires you not to have any fun. And notice the result. You have an unbelieving heart, and that makes you evil, and now you are turning away from God, the living God. Now, what is striking in this? Be constantly vigilant, and brothers, that there not be in any one of you an unbelieving heart. Now, we may take that as potential. Well, potentially, if you have an unbelieving heart, and it might be that you turn away from God. That's actually much more certain than that. Be constantly vigilant that if you go through that process where you begin to not be able to trust God's clear truth, you will fall away. You are departing from God. That's not a potential. That's not a maybe. That's a certainty. If you're not believing the clear truth of God, then you have begun the process of disbelief. You're thinking you can't trust God in everything. You will have evil responses. You will do evil things, and you are turning away from God. That's a very serious problem. Now, what makes it even more of a problem is in many of our good churches, many of our Baptist churches, we have been led to believe that, this is my private area of my life. This is my private belief. You're not supposed to ask me about that. This is just what I believe. It's none of your business. Even if it apparently is wrong. Well, that's just what I believe. Notice the next phrase. But. In order to avoid all this, if you don't want to have an unbelieving heart, if you don't want to be mistaken, if you don't want to go through that process of not trusting God, but encourage one another day after day, as long as it is called today. Encourage each other daily. Now, this is also an interesting word. You know where this word encourage is used? How about Mark chapter 5, verse 17? Mark chapter 5, verse 17. Jesus has come to an area where there were some demons. And the people were raising pigs. And he cast the demons into the pigs, and they went down and drowned themselves. You remember that? And the elders of the city came out, and they encouraged him to leave. It's the same word. Now, I think it was a whole lot more than, hey, if it's convenient for you and it's not too much of a problem, I know it's none of my business, but maybe you would leave the area. I think they were very insistent. What you have done has cost us a lot of money. We don't want you here. But that's the same idea for how we are supposed to interact with one another. Now, this is not judging. This is not judging, because it is supposed to be, well, when someone comes to me and says, hey, I've gotten to know you really well, and I think there's an area in your life, can I help you with it? The possibility demands close personal relationship. That's another thing our good Baptist churches don't do. We come on Sunday morning, we may go to Sunday school, we sing songs together. Hopefully you hear a good sermon. We sing a song and we leave. And we'll see you again in 7 days. This requires that you get to know somebody. You get to know somebody well, so that when you encourage them, you are coming alongside of them. What's interesting, in classical Greek, this is used of someone who helps you in court to make your case. Isn't that interesting? We are supposed to be able to depend upon each other so that we avoid a hardened heart. We avoid unbelief. Now that requires that people know who we are. That requires that when someone comes to us, we have an open ear. And we carefully search our heart, lest there be in any one of us an unbelieving heart. An unbelieving heart is going to lead to evilness and is going to lead us away from God. It's not a possibility. It's not a potential. This is in the future tense. This is what's going to happen. It's a simple future tense. You're going to get sclerosis of the heart. This is really not what we do as Baptists, and we really should. We need to spend more time with each other, praying with each other. And not just for health concerns, that's a good thing. We need to pray for each other's health concerns. Not just when we're going through challenging events, we pray for each other. The writer to Hebrews is saying here, you are concerned with each other in a spiritual sense. You're praying for each other that each of us won't have a hardened heart. And if someone comes to you and says, I want to help you in this area, you have a positive response. The question might be, how do you think you're going to get to heaven? We're American Christians, especially for white males. We have no friends. We're going to do it all on our own, John Wayne style. I'm just going to ride into town and on my own, I'm going to blast away at sin and eventually get into the pearly gates. The writer to Hebrews says, I need other people. If I'm going to make it to heaven without error, without disbelief, someone's going to be encouraging me. A lot of people may be encouraging me. I need to be encouraging other people. This is Sunday where apparently there's football. And that's a big business where you go to a stadium and tens of thousands of people who desperately need exercise are watching dozens of people on the field who desperately need rest. And we call it entertainment. Unfortunately, that's a lot like church. We come to church and we sit in our pews and we are looking at one or two people who are the ministers, we count as people who are further along the road, possibly. That's their job. But the people in the pew also need to be making the effort to be further on the road. It's a simple statement. If you don't interact with other people, because we have a fallen nature, if you don't let other people encourage you, if you don't let other people get close to you, you are going to develop sclerosis of your spiritual heart and you will fall away. And then the next verse. So today, see to it that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We always think it's a better answer. This time it'll be different. This time it'll really meet my needs. This time it will be better than God's plan. But it's a lie. For we have become partakers of Christ. Well, if you are in partnership with Jesus, then you need to be as Jesus is, obedient to the Father. For we have become partakers of Christ, and we do not have time to discuss this next word. If. Oh, you're part of Christ if. And of course, this debate has been going on for 1,000 years. You're part of Christ if, I'll know that you are part of Christ if you are holding fast to that very beginning, how you started, and you're going to keep going until the end. And that word in the Greek, until the end, well, it means until the end. Until the day you stand before his throne. You are holding fast. You're not departing because you have sclerosis. You're not being disobedient because you don't like the truth. And then the clear example, otherwise you are being no different than the rebellious people in the wilderness who clearly heard God's truth and said, I don't want this. Or who were at that point where they needed water. They had seen so many unexplained miracles, but they were still testing God. They came to Moses and said, why have you led us out in the wilderness to die of thirst? I know God has done all these other things, but at this point in my life, I don't think he can come through. Well, you're making God out to be a liar. You're saying you can't trust God. We don't want to be like those rebellious people in the wilderness. We can't trust God. Let us stone Moses. Let's pick our own leader and go back to Egypt. I don't like God's truth. I'm going to find somebody else. I'm going to find another minister that, well, says things that I like to hear. More encouraging things. Things that are, give me more hope for a better lifestyle. I don't like going to that church and hearing that particular minister because he preaches things that make me feel uncomfortable. And notice the evidence that God brings. Despite all of the clear evidence that you have seen, the children of Israel, they had seen his clear evidence in the deliverance from Egypt. All of the plagues, they had gone through the waters on dry ground, a pillar of fire by night, cloud by day. They knew God existed. In your life, you've seen the power of the Almighty. Despite everything that he's done in your life, you're going to get to the point where you say, well, this time it's different. I don't really know if I can believe God. And that frightening verse from Psalm 95:10,